right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janie Adams, and welcome to today's installment, the first installment of the Arizona Histories American Stories series. Like I said, I'm Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Manager and a staff historian for the Arizona Historical Society. I'm also an associate editor of the Journal of Arizona History. A little bit about the Arizona Historical Society. We are a nonprofit educational and cultural institution, and we're a state agency, and we were established in 1864. We collect, preserve, and tell the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibitions, libraries, collections, outreach, educational programs, and through publishing. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. And all of that is made possible by our members. So support for this program and truly support for all of our programs at the Historical Society come in part from membership dues. And so if programming like this speaks to you, please consider becoming a member. Members get free admission to AHS museums, special members only programming and pricing for programming, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. And to learn about membership and all of the things that we do with the Historical Society, you can visit us online at azhs.org today. I recommend checking out our calendar, which has the dates for the whole rest of this program series, which will run through June. Some helpful reminders for today's session. This is a Zoom webinar, so the panelists and I, we cannot see or hear you, so feel free to enjoy your lunch while you watch the session. But if you have a question, you can use the Q&A feature to send in that question, and we will get to those at the end of the session. Oops. The next talk in the series is in 2 weeks with Dr. Maurice Crandall on revolutionary Arizona, kind of an indigenous perspective of Arizona in the Revolutionary War period. Absolutely don't want to miss that one. All right, and without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our guests today. Sean Beienburg and Aaron Kushner are professors at ASU in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, where they have co-directed the Arizona Constitution Project and teach and study American constitutional and political history. So that's what they're going to share with us today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. One brief PSA, if I might, of interest to members of the Arizona Historical Society is in a couple of weeks. So this is part of a series on A250, America at 250. In a couple of weeks, our civic school at ASU is doing a conference on the Declaration of Independence, bringing in prominent historians like Jack Brakove and David Armitage. So if you're interested potentially in coming to the Tempe campus for that, just type in Civic School ASU Spring Conference 2026, and it should pull it up. What I like to focus on for my part of the talk, is we're trying to think about Arizona's founding and what it was about, and particularly how it both connected from and in some places potentially deviated from the sort of founding ideas at the United States level of constitutionalism. So I'm going to actually back us up a little bit and spend some time talking about sort of Revolutionary era and founding America to lay out some ideas that will then be picked up on, sometimes approvingly, sometimes disapprovingly, by Arizona's constitutional founders. And then I'll say a little bit about George Hunt, but then I'll hand it mostly over to my colleague Aaron Kushner, who will talk about Michael Cunniff, who is, as we've said, borrowing John Leshy's term, sort of the James Madison of the Arizona Constitutional Project. So American Constitution, I think, in many ways is based on, or has as one of its core values, this idea of federalism. So if you'll indulge me with 2 minutes of sort of basic civics talk, that's really essential to understand the way Aaron and I understand Arizona's founding. So obviously, very famously, right, the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And those parts are important because they stand for basically sort of two related propositions. One is that the federal government is one of limited and enumerated powers, as is explained in Federalist 39 and Federalist 45 and other texts. And at the same time, the states are, at least as far as the US Constitution is concerned, empowered to act basically unreservedly unless there is a specific restriction on them. In the US Constitution, it conflicts with a federal power or it conflicts with a state constitution. This is just as an aside why state constitutions are so important. We at Scuttle, that's our civic school, have assembled an Arizona pocket constitution, but it's only a third of it because we want it to be a pocket and not a trench coat constitution. But state constitutions have to be long because the states under constitutional structure are basically so strong and empowered. Basically, anytime you want to tell them no, you have to write that in there. And I know that in some ways, for the last, although this is always getting complicated and recomplicated, for the last few decades, the idea I think has come around that basically federalism, states' rights, this is something that conservatives care about and progressives don't. And one of the things that, just sort of preview our talk, we don't think that captures Arizona's political history very well, where in fact, Arizona's founders are deeply imbibed in this deep love of decentralized constitutional federalism that may code conservative today, but in fact, they understand it to have a different ideological valence. And they understand it to be part of the broader American constitutional tradition. And so just as a couple of kind of illustrations of this, I want to, again, back up to the founding and just to point out how fundamental this idea is. Everybody in here, I assume, is familiar with the Declaration of Independence passed by the Second Continental Congress. But there's an earlier version passed by the First Continental Congress, a document that I think is really underappreciated. It's one we assign to many of our students in most of our introductory American classes. The Declaration Resolves of the First Continental Congress. Most of the document is the same as the Declaration of Independence. Count one, the British did this. Count two, the British did that. But the earlier part spells out what are more constitutional objections to British activity. And they say in this Declaration Resolves, the English colonists, from their local circumstances, cannot properly be represented in the British Parliament. They are entitled to a free, and this word is important, exclusive power of legislation in their provincial legislatures in all cases of taxation and internal polity. Con law nerds, the term internal polity means what constitutional law calls police powers, which are the sweeping authorities to act and govern on behalf of the health, welfare, safety, and morals of the people. And under US constitutional law, this is left with the states. So I'm going to repeat those: health, welfare, safety, and morals. So in 1774, the Americans are asserting, and I can bury you with other texts articulating the same position, they are asserting that their local governments, meaning their provincial/state, what will become state governments, have the free and exclusive power of legislation. They understand the American Revolution in many ways to be a British Civil War about federalism. Parliament understands the empire to be one where Parliament is fundamentally supreme, a unitary government. The Americans understand the British Empire to be basically, again, the term is anachronistic, but what we would call federalism. Jack Green, for history nerds, is probably, I think, the clearest articulation of this. And we just had him out talking about a new book he's working on the British who sided with the Americans on this, and said the Americans actually are in the right in this British constitutional debate. And so you don't see this as much in the Declaration of Independence. If you know where to look, it still references to this. They're complaining about we're being subjected to jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. But where you do see it is in the state constitutions in the founding. So, for example, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which is written by John Adams, says, quote, "The people of this Commonwealth have the sole and exclusive right," again here, exclusive right of governing themselves as a free, sovereign, and independent state, and do and forever hereafter shall exercise and enjoy every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not or may not be by them expressly delegated to the United States of America in Congress assembled. So effectively, the 10th Amendment in the state constitution saying their understanding of this relationship is going to be one of divided power where the states retain primary governing authority. You see similar language pop up in the New Hampshire Constitution, which borrows from Massachusetts. You also see it in several of the other New England constitutions and in other Northeastern constitutions. So the Vermont Constitution of 1793, 4 sections after it has probably the first section, I think, in the world basically banning slavery, again, similarly says the people of the state, by their legal representatives, have the sole, inherent, and exclusive right of governing and regulating the internal police of the same. We don't want to spend the whole time on the founding and civil, so I'm going to sort of jump ahead, but I'm going to assert 2 points. You can ask me about them or challenge me on them in the Q&A. This understanding of American constitutionalism is not killed by the Civil War. The Civil War is not basically won between nationalist Republicans in the North and states' rights Southerners and Democrats. The Northerners do not understand the Civil War as being about that. They view it as against secession, but so, for example, did Andrew Jackson, and no one questions his sort of states' rights credibility. So the Civil War is understood by most people at the time as fundamentally eliminating secession and nullification, but not this basic architecture in which most power remains with the states, most political loyalty is in some ways your day-to-day loyalty is still attached to your state, even if you think that the union is supreme and you're loyal to that, right? They don't view it necessarily as suddenly they're indifferent to the states, or the states are just satellites of the United States government. You see, if you think that the Civil War is about just nation versus state, federal power versus state power in that sense, the Reconstruction debates, for example, don't make sense. They spend a ridiculous amount of time trying to understand how can we govern the South after the Civil War if they think that if the Civil War is just about the national government wins and can govern it directly, those debates don't make any sense. As Frederick Douglass observes in an article to The Atlantic in 1866, there remains such an idea as the right of each state to control its own local affairs. An idea, he says, which is, by the way, more deeply rooted in the minds of men of all sections of the country than any one other political idea. I'm emphasizing that because it's essential to understand that Americans across ideology and across region think that this understanding of federalism is theirs. It's a heritage that they can claim. And so this is partly why Cunniff and Hunt and other Arizonans will latch onto and so aggressively embrace this understanding of federalism, because they don't view it as regional or sectarian or ideological. They view this as fundamentally what the American constitutional project is about. So I'll come back to that thread. While we're talking about state constitutions a second ago, I want to point out one other feature or debate that's happening. This is actually more of a debate. More or less everybody except for Alexander Hamilton is on board with our division of federalism that I just articulated. But there is a debate at the time of the founding in how do we best interpret the Declaration of Independence and apply it. We have this exciting moment of self-government. What do we do with this? And so we see 2 examples, 2 different understandings, attempts to implement this in 2 of our most famous state constitutions, Pennsylvania in 1776 and Massachusetts in 1780. Pennsylvania basically understands the Declaration of Independence to be prioritizing this idea of self-government. And so they put through what is very much a direct democracy understanding of constitutionalism. The Pennsylvania Constitution that they draft more or less concurrently with the Declaration of Independence is unicameral, doesn't have 2 houses. It has incredibly weak separation of powers. It doesn't have a governor. It has a very, very weak president who, in a collaboration with the council, is selected to 1-year terms by the legislature, which means that governor is very, very keenly towing the line of the legislature because he knows he'll be replaced otherwise. It has annual elections, right? So very much the understanding that they have in this Pennsylvania Constitution is that the people will be deeply invested in the arcana of government, and they will be paying close attention to this. And so, in fact, the main check that they have is not judicial review. It's not separation of powers. They think that the main check in the government is going to be the provision of the Pennsylvania Constitution that basically requires all of its material to be printed publicly and passed around publicly. That the citizens will be so excited about self-government that they will, in effect, pay detailed attention to what's happening in their government. And so, therefore, rights will be protected by that. Overreach from the government will be protected by that. Good policy will be protected by that. So that direct democracy understanding is how Pennsylvania does it. Massachusetts takes the opposite take and John Adams writes a constitution that is bicameral, that has a strong governor, that has longer terms, that has meaningful judicial review. And so if that sounds more like the system that ends up getting adopted, then that's right. Our later architects of the US Constitution repeatedly say what they did in Pennsylvania was a nice experiment, but it doesn't work. Direct democracy doesn't work and is ultimately corrosive to the long-term health of a republic. What you need is sort of the measured institutional checks to serve as brakes and guardrails. Not to say the people don't ultimately govern, but the people don't immediately get what they want constantly all the time. And so that understanding of sort of direct democracy, unicameralism, is regarded as a sort of mistaken path of American constitutionalism for much of American history. That they've sort of messed it up in Pennsylvania, and we don't want to try that again. Okay, so jumping now ahead to the progressive era. So both of these threads appear in the progressive era, which at its core, right, there's an understanding. Again, I'm not an economic historian or an economist, so I'm just repeating what they thought, not whether they were right to think it or not. But there was increasingly, obviously, a concern that basically industrial capitalism was concentrating political and economic power in ways that were disadvantageous to sort of the average worker. And so you see various techniques that are being developed to deal with this. Some of this is antitrust. Some of this is regulation. So you start seeing populists who in turn eventually become progressives in some ways. They're not quite the same, but there's some overlap. Are wanting to use what they see as the 10th Amendment police powers of their state to regulate the economy, to basically sand off what they see as the harder edges of industrial capitalism. So they want to pass laws, for example, regulating how many hours you can work, what mining conditions can look like, what potentially union negotiations ought to look like. So various kinds of legislation like that. And again, they constantly invoke the 10th Amendment and their police powers to do so. This is what they think is the Constitution lets them do this, right? Yes, of course, the federal government can regulate if you're shipping a product across state lines, but what your conditions are in a mine that you go down into in, say, Arizona, they don't view that as any of the Fed's business. What they want is the Feds to leave them alone when they pass that kind of legislation. And so we have this narrative that the progressive sort of intellectuals are fundamentally against the constitutional order in the sense of viewing it as obsolete. So what's often quoted for this is like Woodrow Wilson saying effectively it was obsolete. The founders built their constitutionalism on sort of Whig theories of checks and balances. But what we want is a simpler and more efficient system. In terms of federal-state relations, you see folks like Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert Croly increasingly skeptical that there's even a role for states at all. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt, this is partly why his inner circle of Taft and Lodge and Elihu Root all turn on him in 1912. Roosevelt has come around to basically saying that the states are obsolete. Interest in states' rights he calls a fetish. It's just not something that sort of serious constitutional thinkers ought to be doing anymore. Wilson, interestingly, is actually relatively orthodox on federalism. And this is something that I think Professor Kushner will talk about because it connects to the way Cunniff thinks. So Wilson is orthodox on that. Both of his judicial appointees, McReynolds and Brandeis, are very states' rights oriented. In fact, Brandeis, during the early parts of the New Deal, yells at the Harvard lawyers for centralizing things in the FDR administration. He thinks it's unconstitutional. So Wilson is a critic of the separation of powers, more defensive of federalism. But there is a line of case sort of connecting all these together, and particularly something that Theodore Roosevelt pushes. There is a concern that a line of judicial doctrine is being developed in the federal and especially state courts, which is called liberty of contract or substantive due process. And there's slight variations on this, and it's not a con law seminar, so I'll try to be sort of as short as I can on this. But the basic idea is that there is some level of an unenumerated right to be basically a free economic citizen. That being a free citizen of the United States implies being a broadly free economic citizen. And so judges, particularly in the state courts in New York, and this is important because this is what gets Theodore Roosevelt so upset. The state courts in New York are very aggressive about overturning what most people are seeing as sort of decent, in some sense, boring regulations on the economy. So Roosevelt is really mad that the New York courts strike down a provision that says, like, you can't make cigars in a tenement house. Right? He gets this. A bunch of his constituents say, like, it smells, it smells bad in our apartment when the one next door is making cigars. So he gets this banned, and they strike it down and say, no, if you rented the apartment, you have the right to do in that apartment basically what you want, unless it's immoral. They have their like sort of prostitution, et cetera, exemptions. But they basically say, like, you have a free economic authority to do that. This gets picked up in a very, very small number of federal cases, particularly the Lochner case. In which maximum hours for bakers are overturned on the grounds that this doesn't seem connected to health laws. There is, again, a narrative that sort of federal courts are sweeping up large numbers of regulations passed by the states. In terms of the quantity, that's not accurate. But there are enough high-profile instances of it, particularly when sort of nudged on by folks like Theodore Roosevelt, that there is among populists and progressives a concern that the states are basically being stripped of their police powers. The states are not able to use those robust 10th Amendment powers to act on behalf of the public good. And they view this as a problem of both separation of powers, that judges are imposing economic preferences rather than enforcing constitutional text, and they view it as a problem when the federal courts are doing it of federalism. And so this is why in 1910, 1912, 1920, in this sort of era, there are debates about how should we modify judicial review. The strongest and craziest version is Felix Frankfurter is trading notes about whether they should just repeal the 14th Amendment altogether, since that had been the section that had been used to create this liberty of contract. Other places want to do the recall of opinions. That's one Theodore Roosevelt wants to do. Arizona very famously institutes the recall of judges, which we'll say a little bit more about. Some states impose a supermajority requirement, but there is a fear that judges effectively are imposing a vision of sort of libertarian economics that the Constitution of the states and the federal government are neutral on, that the Constitution doesn't set economic policy in that sense. And so kind of transitioning to our two characters, Michael Cunniff, at this time is basically a young man. He is basically a protege of and works for a judge named Alton Parker. Alton Parker is basically completely forgotten now, but he is, in 1904, the Democratic Party presidential nominee. And you think, how did this guy who I've never heard of become Democratic Party presidential nominee? Amazingly, and this is something that is sort of amazingly, Parker is elevated to this position because people find an opinion that he writes as a New York appellate court judge incredibly constitutionally compelling. So literally like, wow, this guy understands the Constitution so well. Let's make him a presidential party nominee. And Parker's is with the famous opinion is he writes an opinion defending the authority of the state of New York to pass the law that later gets overturned in Lochner. Generally speaking, the New York courts are sort of more libertarian than the federal courts. This one is an exception. But Cunniff writes basically a description of Parker that I think illustrates Cunniff's own understanding of what proper constitutional interpretation ought to look like. So of Parker, Cunniff writes that Parker was protective of the liberty of the individual, no special privileges, conservative, strict construction of the Constitution, rigid observance of the checks and balances in the machinery of our government, so that the centralized national government will not trench on the governments of the several local communities, which I think very much is in line with how George Hunt later on will articulate what he understands the relationship between the state of Arizona and the national government to be. So this is a little bit of a long quote, I'm sorry, but as I'm reading through this, I want you to be thinking about what Supreme Court justices today or in recent history does this sound like? Hunt says, while the old idea of the right of a state to nullify federal laws is gone, that is to say, the Civil War has ended nullification, it does not follow that while the federal government is supreme in its field, the states are not equally supreme in their own. It appears to me that where new questions arise that were obviously not contemplated by the makers of the Constitution, they should be handled by the states in accordance with the reserve power of the 10th Amendment or granted to the federal government by proper constitutional amendment rather than strained legal decision of the court. He goes on to say, the gradual destruction of states' rights has been aided by the, quote, tendency of the courts to ignore the literal wording of the Constitution and make their decision on what they considered the greatest good for the greatest number. So what jumps out at folks? Hunt says that we should be paying attention to what the makers of the Constitution thought. We should have a strong deference to the 10th Amendment in the states. And if we wanted a new federal power, the only way to do that is through adding a power through Article 5. It is not through flexibly interpreting the Constitution in line with current needs. So I would suggest this is basically endorsing original understanding, states' rights, and strict construction of the Constitution. In other words, George Hunt, the first governor of Arizona, very progressive governor of a progressive state, has a constitutional theory that is effectively indistinguishable from that of Antonin Scalia or Clarence Thomas or Neil Gorsuch, precisely because George Hunt thinks that states' rights is what lets the states pass, using, again, their 10th Amendment police powers, legislation on behalf of the public good of Arizona. So they want to pass regulations setting hours. Again, the courts generally are pretty deferential to that. Hunt and his allies want to pass legislation, the one that they are particularly invested in, and Cunniff pushes this at the convention as well, is they want to pass legislation protecting American workers from foreign competition. They want to basically set caps on the percentage of citizens and things like that that can work in particular fields. That gets overturned by the federal Supreme Court on sort of a complicated, partly liberative contract decision, and Hunt rages that this is a violation of states' rights, that the states ought to be able to basically act when they're not explicitly violating the text of the Constitution. And sort of a funny example of this, Hunt will later complain that Calvin Coolidge, who is everyone's idea of a big government nationalist, consolidationist, he will complain that Calvin Coolidge, of all people, is not sufficiently deferential to states' rights in Arizona. So that is to say, the founders of Arizona, Hunt and Cunniff, are invested in this idea that states' rights, strict interpretation of the 10th Amendment, is something that empowers the states to act, not something that is basically a tool for plutocracy. So the last thing that I want to point out before I hand it over to Professor Kushner is a part of Arizona's constitution. So in that sense, Arizona's constitutionalism looks very conservative, even if its policy views are progressive. One place where they are constitutionally progressive is they attempt to bring back some of the ideas of direct democracy that had been considered repudiated from sort of the Pennsylvania understanding. So Arizona's constitution, Cunniff and Hunt want unicameralism. They fail at the convention. They try it early on in the state legislature in a very, very famous, very, very funny. Look up an article called Arizona State Senate Suicide. It was printed in, I think it was like a bar association article maybe 15 years ago. And it goes through the legislative history of this. But the Senate voted to dissolve itself and become unicameral on grounds that this would be easier for the people to understand and follow. The Arizona fail at that, and then George Hunt gets signatures in it's either 16 or 14, and it fails there 2-1. But there's an attempt by Arizona progressives to bring back unicameralism. They use short elections. They want to have even the governor elected to 2-year terms. That's unusual. They want a plural executive in which basically the different officers are elected separately. Note that that is the same assumption of the Pennsylvania Constitution, that rather than just having the president or the governor appoint all of the other executive branch people, vigilant voters will be paying attention to the details of government. And this, in a sense, is also what the direct democracy features assume. Citizens can be entrusted to write the details of legislation through an initiative. Citizens can be trusted to veto poor legislation or unconstitutional legislation through the referendum. And citizens will prudently exercise the recall for officers who have not followed their charges or their constitution. And Cunniff is very explicit. These are supposed to be used in emergencies, not just because a judge, for example, handed down a bad ruling in some place, right? So Cunniff, for example, views various judicial constraints as ways to enforce faithful implementation of the Arizona Constitution. But they very much have an inversion where even though they're constitutionally conservative on federalism, they are progressive in the sense of institutional redesign at the state level. They think the 10th Amendment at its core also lets state governments structure themselves in ways that might be annoying to Washington, but it doesn't harm Utah if we do something dumb in Arizona. For them, states' rights allows them to deal with local conditions and recognize the diversity of their political culture and how it's different than, for example, New Mexico or Utah, or for my Pennsylvania-born compatriot here, or Pennsylvania native compatriot here, Pennsylvania of 1790 or or of 1874. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Kushner to talk more about Michael Cunniff, who is, we're not going to spend as much on George Hunt because David Berman wrote the book on it. Just go read that one. But we've done some research on, again, Michael Cunniff, who is sort of the legislative right hand of getting Arizona both statehood and then early legislative sessions. So I'll hand it over to Professor Kushner.
Thanks, Sean, and thank you, Janie, for hosting this event. On Saturday, we'll celebrate 114 years of Arizona statehood. And remarkably, we're still using the same constitution, albeit a very, very long one. My home state, as Sean mentioned, is Pennsylvania, and they had a slew of constitutions, including a convention since 1912. In 1968 was their most recent convention. Other states have changed, where Arizona, because of its unique design, has not had to start over from scratch in a way that some other places have. So we want to look at who is the guy, who is Michael Cunniff, who is the man who is arguably responsible for more of the text of that 1910, 1912 Constitution at the convention than anyone else. And I want to point out, if there's one takeaway from this, that just like Arizona's history is complicated and perhaps more complicated than others realize, Michael Cunniff, the James Madison, as John Leshy calls him, of Arizona, is also a very complicated man. He is part of a Boston Irish descent family, well immersed in the Democratic Party. He attends Democratic National Conventions. As Dr. Beienburg mentioned, he supports Judge Parker at these events. He is also very much interested in the inner workings of democracy and of making government work for the people. Now, he's in New England. New England is crowded. Sanitation's not great. The conditions that he grows up witnessing are such that he finds himself looking west quite often. He becomes a journalist and a teacher for a little while. He goes to Wisconsin to teach at a university for a brief stint there. And then he develops tuberculosis, which is not uncommon at the time. And out of the result of this diagnosis, sort of at the same time, he takes a journalistic trip to the territories, to Arizona and New Mexico, to see what the fuss is about, because New Mexicans are joint statehood. Okay. Arizonans, however, militantly opposed to joint statehood with New Mexico. And because, he calls these the last of the territories, everyone's sort of looking west at the time. He wants to see what the fuss is about. So he comes out here to both New Mexico and Arizona, and he falls in love with the place. He, and I quote here, appreciates the flinty resolve of Arizonans to oppose joint statehood with New Mexico. He appreciates the character of the people and the willingness they have to put in hard work to really perpetuate what he sees as the benefit of American civilization. He also sees the added benefit of the dry air for his condition. So as a man who is given a limited time left to live, he takes up with his family, his wife and his 2 children, and his brother, Bernard, and he goes to Crown King, Arizona, and he starts a mining company. He serves as sort of the director of the mine, and his brother handles more of the day-to-day. Being a Harvard-educated political man that he is, Cunniff is sort of immediately understood by his locals and his neighbors to be someone who should probably be a public figure. He is elected very quickly to the Arizona Constitutional Convention that held in 1910 to represent Yavapai County there. And at the convention, he becomes very good friends with George Hunt. Now, the convention, for those unfamiliar, 52 delegates from across Arizona, this is essentially a Democratic party. There are very few Republicans at the convention, so the divisions that appear and arise while the delegates are hashing things out are really between the progressive, the radical Democrats, the more moderate Democrats, and then some of the more conservative Democrats. Cunniff tends to fall in with at the convention, sort of the more moderate but lean radical, as opposed to like Morris Goldwater, famous figure, who's moderate, more lean conservative. Now, his seatmate, Homer Wood, who we'll come back to in a moment, is much more radical progressive Democrat at the convention. So Cunniff, with the friends that he's made, Hunt, Wood, Goldwater, sort of cursorily, finds himself as the man basically with the editing skills to take over the Committee on Style and Revision as sort of the guy responsible for the language and responsible for mediating in a lot of instances between all these other more strongly opinioned figures at the convention itself. So he's not all academic, though, and this is, some of the things that we've tried to flesh out in our understanding of him is what was this guy like? There's reports of some altercations that he has with future senators, Henry Amherst, for example. Some reports say they came to blows. Some reports say they just hollered at each other. And another report oddly says that somebody else got hit while they were arguing. But I think that this brings a bit of color to this character. He's not just sort of the bookish James Madison who maybe stayed out of the interpersonal stuff. He was willing to get into it with a couple people. And I think that's...
And the rabid dog.
And the rabid dog, yes. One of his first introductions to Arizona is a rabid dog attacks his children and he has to fight it off. So he's appreciates Arizona's sort of rough and ready resolve at forming a government. And by forming a government, he's not unaware about getting his hands dirty, right? So physically building something, building houses, building a government from the ground up, he's all in. So after the convention, as Dr. Beienburg mentioned before, and sort of famously, Arizonans wanted the judicial recall. Right, so Cunniff is a supporter of all these things. He's a supporter of the ballot initiative. He initially has very high thresholds for the initiative process. He lowers them at the convention because he sees that that's sort of the way the wind is blowing. But regardless, he wants to make Arizonans able to connect with their government in a way that you can't out east. He supports, like I said, the ballot initiative, the legislative referendum, and the recall of judges. Now, at the convention, there is a bit of disagreement because they know that William Howard Taft has specifically opposed the judicial recall. Taft has very strong opinions on the judiciary, doesn't believe that judges should be recalled by the people because one of the couple of reasons, that he fears that people won't like a decision and people will recall judges. Okay. Even though the judge is doing an otherwise good job. Doesn't want judges to be bothered by this. Taft famously spikes the Constitution because of judicial recall. They take it out. It's approved. Afterwards, Cunniff, like Madison, is elected to the first legislature. He's in the Senate. He has to calm down one of his more radical friends, Homer Wood, who wants to scathingly, basically tick off Taft with a bill reinserting judicial recall and insulting the president. Cunniff is moderating. Well, buddy, we're gonna institute it, but we don't want to needlessly tick off the president. He shepherds that through, and that sort of sets kind of the tone for what he eventually does in the legislature. He still plays this role of moderator, but a moderator who's not afraid to sort of get into it with his both party mates and his opponents. One of his opponents, as you might or might not know, ended up being Francis Munns. So Cunniff, who is one of the leading suffragettes in Arizona, Cunniff is at the convention and elsewhere, sort of almost inexplicably, sort of opposed to women's suffrage, but he's not vocal about it. He sort of scuttles these things in the convention and quietly votes no in the legislature, basically making an enemy of Francis Munns and other more friendly senators, friendly politicians like Morris Goldwater, who were more willing to support women's suffrage. Eventually, Cunniff and Wood, who are both from Yavapai County, will lose their seats in the Senate to Munns and Goldwater because of this sort of back and forth debate. He has such a complicated legacy. He is willing to obviously create a constitution that is very open to radical change, and he defends that. In fact, as Dr. Beienburg mentioned, he, alongside George Hunt, Homer Wood, are supportive of this unicameralism. So the Senate votes to destroy itself. And the result of this is rather hilarious. Again, I second, look up the article Sean Beienburg just mentioned. It's pretty hilarious. They are mocked on the House floor. The House says, well, these people are crazy. They're fellow senators. Some of them say these are crazy. There are threats to disenfranchise the entire county of Yavapai County and to make sure that these two can't vote or serve in office. So it's not a popular opinion that they're holding, to go back to unicameralism, but it is indicative of their mindset here, as close to the people as possible. This is what we want. So Cunniff, while he opposed women's suffrage, again, there's some detail. Dr. Beienburg can speak more about this in the Q&A. He wrote the book on prohibition, but there's obviously the connection between allowing women's suffrage and prohibition, the banning of alcohol, that I'm sure he can talk more about if you're interested after. Point being, Cunniff was willing to create this constitutional structure and defend it on the Senate floor in order to allow people to change things that he himself might not necessarily have supported. So his progressivism extended beyond his immediate policy preferences. And part of it could be the fact that he was dying, and he dies very, very soon thereafter. 1914, that Christmas, Cunniff actually passes away just after losing his Senate seat, along with Homer Wood, to Francis Munns and Morris Goldwater. We don't have, unlike James Madison, who never stopped writing and who we can't stop reading about even if we want to, we don't have Cunniff's papers. And part of that, we've spent a couple of years now trying to dig up, see what papers of his exist, to try to know why that this guy had sort of the contradictions that he seemingly had. He was, like I said, against women's suffrage. He was not vocally against school segregation. And yet he defended the institutions that allowed those things to change. And so we'd like to know why. One of the reasons that we speculate, or at least I speculate, that this happened, his wife, Everesta Spink Cunniff, marries very soon after his death, marries his college roommate, actually, in a sort of a funny story, funny turn of events. And we believe that she destroyed his papers at that time. We do have some of the correspondence between Hunt and Cunniff that really goes to illustrate their intense friendship and their support for one another through the convention. And I see we're almost at time, so I want to throw it back to Dr. Beienburg here.
Yeah, so just to sort of recommend that the good folks at the Journal of Arizona History published our piece on this, so we would just direct your attention to some of the stories there. But Cunniff, the end of his life is almost it's very elegiac, right? Where he's this guy who knows he's dying. He is basically he can read the writing on the wall that he's going to lose the primaries. So he and Homer Wood pack it in, and they see themselves replaced by their political rivals. And he's writing to Hunt back, and they're writing saying, like, is our system basically going to hold? Is this gonna last? And yeah, then he dies, and we don't have his papers which we know he kept. That was one of the heartbreaking spots, is when I found a letter he writes to George Hunt saying, I have all the documents from the Arizona Constitutional Convention. Any records you want, you just write me and tell me, and I got it for you. So we had the equivalent of Madison's notes, but presumably, and hard to begrudge his widow with trying to deal with his two kids and move across back to the east. But presumably the papers didn't make it across. If any of you know otherwise, that would be amazing.
Yes.
But yeah, just sort of is the sort of closing takeaway here that we think that Cunniff and Hunt particularly may have something useful to think about. This isn't a current events talk, but we often collapse the way we talk about constitutionalism and politics and policy. And they, I think, show that Arizona's founding not only complicates that narrative, but also is this really fascinating both defense of parts of the American constitutional order, while recognizing that at least at the state level, that constitutional order gives them the freedom to arrange institutions in ways that John Adams or James Madison might have found unpalatable. So this sort of fascinating paradox of using the federalism that the founders bequeathed us, but for policy and institutional arrangements that those founders may not themselves have particularly appreciated. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. I mean, that was excellent and a great reminder. I think that politics, are national, are statewide, but also are local and so personal, right? I think that kind of looking at it from a longer history of, how do we organize state constitutions just kind of generally versus one particular almost biographical approach to understanding this. I think that is so powerful to think about all of those different ways that all of these things are so interwoven. And when you pull on one thread, you pull on all the threads. So as we start to get some questions in from our audience, one of the things that I think came up for me, and I had to chuckle to myself because I thought, wow, I haven't heard the phrase unicameral in 15 years. So I'm kind of thinking about civics education. I don't have a fully formed question about that, but we were kind of chatting earlier before our audience joined us as we're approaching the anniversary of Arizona statehood and thinking about why it's significant. How do you explain to young people that, yes, this thing that happened 115 years ago is important?
I think one of the things that I like to do in the classroom here is to really connect with students that, and this helps me too, that these were human beings who were doing human things, who had different motivations. All 52, we went through all the convention records. There's 52 different, often more than 52 different opinions on any one issue, even though there are 52 delegates at the convention. So these are all people coming from their own backgrounds, bringing their own talents and qualities to these debates. And then there's the people who were living in Arizona, right? There's so many stories here that are, I love how you put that. You tug on one thread. Absolutely. I think that really students connect well with other people and human stories. So I think starting there, at least from my perspective, is one entry point into a good civics discussion.
Yeah, and just so our general philosophy, so our civics school, it's called a school, but it's a department at ASU, is that we are very invested in looking at primary sources. So even though we're both poli-sci PhDs, like we're really historians in some ways. At least I am. He's pre-tenure, so whatever, but he can say otherwise. But primary sources help with reading this stuff. But I think also one thing that we try to equip our students to do is I think it's actually easy to tune out of politics with a current events take because it just seems like people shouting at each other. And so, for example, again, like maybe before we even get to squabbling about pick whatever policy issue has you angry about, like what are the constitutional implications of that, or what the actual like who's supposed to be doing this? So not only does that, I think, help us create a dialogue and a discourse that is more productive and thoughtful, because that you're not. It prepares you to basically think about these things in a more civil way. If we're thinking about, okay, is this actually constitutional? Is this not constitutional? And then we can get to the debates about the merits of a policy. But one of the things that we try to do is we think of our civics education as pre-partisan in the sense of I'm not going to tell you what you should think about X, Y, and Z issue, but what we will get you to do is to think about what's federalism about, what state constitutional is about, what are the tools that exist, what is actually the proper lever I should be pulling if I want to make change, right? It probably isn't yelling at the president to do something. In fact, very much might be, probably is your state legislator or your city council or the initiative process or something like that, right? And so, particularly, I have come to really appreciate, in some ways, the fact that state constitutions are easier to amend. You can make an argument about whether it's too easy to amend at the detail, in any particular thing. But conceptually speaking, I like that the federal constitution is harder to amend than the state constitutions are. That you want a bigger consensus before you're making some sweeping change for the country, but that you can actually have a lot more involvement and the stakes are lower at the state level. So as you alluded to, we work on the Arizona Constitution Project. And one of the things we try to do is to get citizens to be aware, even like lots of people don't even really understand there's a state constitution, which is horrifying to us. But like that's in fact your good way to participate in civics much of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when I talk to people about the Arizona Constitution, at the Historical Society, we have the benefit of having some really excellent artifacts related to the signing of the Arizona Constitution. And so that's a really great entry point into that story. But people love the story about judicial recall and citizen initiative because I think it really speaks to kind of that, I think, Dr. Kushner, you said that flinty kind of attitude that Arizonans have. And I think that that's really fascinating to think about that kind of caricature trait over time. And pre-partisan is, I think, a fabulous way to put that. And I think that political science and history and the study of the past are kind of all compressed in different ways where, I kind of constantly find myself explaining that it's, history is about the facts, sure, and it's about the materials, but it's also about understanding what they mean in context. And that's really valuable. There's a comment here from one of our audience members that says that they think it's interesting that the idea of constitutionality is binary, and that so many people today and in the past see the idea as fluid.
Yeah, it's sort of just what you were just saying too. If you think about how Cunniff and Hunt and other Arizonans understood constitutionalism, it doesn't appear, it's because I almost think that a lot of them are coming at it from the perspective, okay, we want to secure the genuine source, we want to secure our rights, so we want to maintain the balance between federal and state governments. And context, absolutely, as Mark says again, the context is incredibly important. Because I think, well, how can we best serve the people? What can we do with this? Because police powers, I mean, there's not a list that says all the things that the state can do. Well, let's see what we can do. Can we regulate? Can we keep children out of the mines? Yes. Can we limit the work day? Yes, right? Can we do sort of these things? So I think, yeah, that's not a binary issue for them back then, certainly.
I mean, I'll qualify that a little bit. I mean, they certainly have a sense of constitutions matter are important in terms of what is allowed and what is not allowed. And that's why they want to be cautious about what goes in it and not, right? So they certainly don't have a kind of modern deconstructionist thing that like all constitutionalism is relative. I didn't take you to be saying that. I just wanted to qualify that. But they very much feel like, no, we're writing something that, it matters what we do. How we design it matters because of the historical context. So we are in a moment, Cunniff and them would say, where we need to be more cautious about, from their perspective, what big capital is doing to labor. But he's skeptical, as we write about, he's skeptical of labor unions, right? And so, there's often this narrative that Arizona goes from being progressive at the founding to basically conservative from the 1940s when Barry Goldwater gets them to pass right to work. And I think there's actually a way to understand a sort of through line of, no, what they both share is a sort of Jacksonian skepticism of big institutions pushing people around, right? And so it's not, in fact, inconsistent to say in this moment, we're more concerned about big business, but in the next moment, we're more concerned about what we think is too strong labor unions. And from Cunniff's perspective, the through line is, amusingly, he gets derided for being a socialist. And he's really pissed about that because he says, like, no, I'm a capitalist. I'm a mine owner. Like, I don't want this stuff. And there's places where he gets really pedantic in like votes by himself, pushing back against the municipal operation of various things. He says it's socialist. But yeah, so they very much, but they do in some ways decouple their policy from their constitutionalism, but they want to draw up a constitution at the state level that is flexible enough to let them shift around on policy as necessary. So again, it's this really interesting mix of constitutionality is maybe binary, but how you design it is a mix of sort of conservatism and progressivism.
So for our kind of wrap up question, this program is part of a series kind of looking at the nation's 250th anniversary and where Arizona fits into that. And I think that, a lot of Arizonans feel that they don't, and feel that they, Arizona was a state in 1776. So, it doesn't really matter to them. But I think a lot of folks are also kind of taking this as a moment and as initiative to educate themselves and people in their lives, particularly young people, about kind of American history and American civics. So do you have recommendations for, where people can learn more on these kinds of topics and just want to learn more generally about how the nation works?
Yeah, the Federalist Papers are always it's a very civicsy, it's a very sort of basic civicsy answer, but you might, honestly, one good way to do it is we have a class in our civics school, CEL 200, that we've assembled as basically a core reader of primary source texts. So you've got that, and then there's a sort of high school version, which is called our civic literacy curriculum, which takes many of those texts and does sort of abridged primary sources for those. So those are just two sort of specific resources specifically about the American constitutional order. I might actually, to your question about Arizonans are wondering, what influence have we had? I actually, in a lot of my scholarly writings, take the impish case that Arizona is probably the place that is most responsible for people caring about federalism again. So, in the wake of the New Deal, basically Franklin Roosevelt convinces Democrats that federalism is sort of obsolete and not for them anymore. Even though, again, a few years before, he himself had been sort of very much a George Hunt person. We literally have letters between him and George Hunt saying states' rights is awesome, like the big government Republicans are evil. And so there's, and obviously there's reasons that federalism sort of fell out of favor because the only people quoting it for a while were Southern racists who were trying to use it to ignore the 14th Amendment. But, you could argue Barry Goldwater basically gets people talking about federalism again, and he gets several of his allies, William Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor, put on the Supreme Court. And, O'Connor is deeply committed from the beginning. People have this like, oh, did she shift her views or whatever? That may be, but on something. But from the day she's appointed until the day she leaves office, she is deeply, deeply committed to this vision of federalism and states' rights and pushing back in some ways on the narrative that federalism has just become like a conservative thing. So that's actually a specific feature where Arizonans were the ones saying, hey, actually, like federalism is a part of this constitutional order, and it's not just a right-wing thing. This is something that all of us should be able to cherish as our constitutional heritage.
You're here.
Well, awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's never going to be a hard sell for me to say that, Arizona is the leading voice in a national conversation. That's usually my stance. But I just want to thank you both for taking the time out of your day to share your research with us. And we'll catch you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really enjoyed it.
Bye.